Welcome to the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast. Whether you are a seasoned professional or a first-time fundraiser, we have the advice you need to take your next step toward major gift mastery. I'm your host, Tom Dauber, President of Abundant Vision Philanthropic Consulting. This is Tom Dauber with the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast. I'm pleased to have Stephen Newland on today. Now, Stephen's a little different than some of the other guests I've had on. In fact, I believe he's the first non-fundraiser I've ever had on the show. So buckle your seats. We're in for a wild ride. Stephen, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Yeah, well, thanks, Tom. It's honored to be the first non-fundraiser on the show, so that's awesome. I'm Stephen Newland. I'm located in Atlanta, just outside of Atlanta, and I'm a fractional CFO for nonprofits. Fractional CFO can mean a lot of different things, and so the simplest way I like to explain it is I help with things like budgeting, creating a budget, and then managing to that budget, building a cash flow forecast so nonprofits have visibility into how much cash am I going to have in the bank 6, 12, 18 months into the future, as best as we can project that. Building grant budgets, overseeing accounting, that's essentially in a nutshell what I do. And then overall financial strategy to build a sustainable organization.
That sounds like a lot of useful stuff. Do you find that nonprofits need a lot of help in those areas?
I do. I think there's just a lack of resources available to nonprofits in this specific area. There's a lot of stuff available to startups and small businesses, but there's not a lot that focus on nonprofit. There are quite a few differences between nonprofit and just standard finance. And then not to mention that with a lot of nonprofits, time is of the essence, right? And so you've got to be more efficient in every single area, and finance can be confusing, and you might get one question in your email, and then all of a sudden you spent 30 minutes researching the sales tax question. You're like, what happened to my day? So,
yeah, no, I totally get that. So before we get into the nuts and bolts of things, could you tell me a little bit about yourself, what you enjoy doing when you're not focused on your professional life?
Yeah, I love that. So I am a huge sports fan. So I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio. Yeah, I'm here in Atlanta now, but I grew up in Cincinnati. So I grew up a huge Reds fan, Bengals fan, which being a Bengals fan when I was growing up was rough. But now we're doing good. And then a Cincinnati Bearcats fan. So I love sports. I'm a big Arsenal fan, if anyone's a fan of the Premier League, soccer.
There you go.
And I enjoy playing poker. So those are a few things I like to do.
Okay, so this next question is very important then. Can you do the icky shuffle?
Oh, I don't think I could give it a very, very bad attempt. No one would want to see that. Thank goodness this is a podcast.
That's right. No pressure there. Now, time for some true confessions. Overall, I've had some great experience with fiscal types in the nonprofit world. However, I can definitely think of some times where those relationships just went sideways for me. We weren't communicating well. We didn't understand each other. It almost seemed like we were talking different languages at times. Now, my experience that those sorts of difficulties between fiscal types and fundraisers aren't uncommon. And that's why I wanted you to be on the show today, Stephen, maybe to help my listeners avoid some of the common pitfalls that can happen when fiscal officers and development officers are trying to work together. Could you walk me through some of the most common points of tension you see that come up between fundraisers and fiscal officers?
Yeah, I'll kind of go through a couple quick bullet points, and then we can maybe dive deeper into any of them that seem interesting. But first, before I even go down that route, I want to kind of rag on us finance people for a little bit, just for a quick second. I want to build some brownie points up. So we have a tendency to overcomplicate things and to be very rigid, and sometimes we have to be because there's certain accounting rules in place. But I find that us finance and accounting people, just as a broad brush, are a little too black and white sometimes. And I think that is kind of at the root cause of maybe where some of the tension starts to come into play. I think the really, really great finance and accounting people see the overall picture and can operate in the gray. But I think a lot of times we get that bad rap because there's a lot of that black and white, and it's hard for some finance and accounting people to kind of to see the gray. So those are some brownie points. Hopefully I won some brownie points with some of your listeners.
I hope so.
But a few of the tension points that I see, I think the first thing is just managing the tension of raising dollars while thinking about the administrative side of the house. So on the finance side, I'm thinking about, okay, how many different systems are we going to have? Let's say we're at a gala and we're going to raise money through a silent auction, through a live auction, through tickets. I'm thinking about, I got to calculate the fair market value of everything to get the tax deductible receipt correct. I got to manage like 2 or 3 different systems to make sure receipts are going out correctly. Maybe there's 7 different ways money can come in the door. And so just thinking about that administrative burden for that next dollar raise and how to get that dollar in the door. $1 in the door can look very different to finance than it might on the fundraising side.
How so?
Just I guess because we're seeing the behind the scenes, like the administrative piece of it. So that is typically how I'm looking at it. I'm thinking about, okay, I have to do these, 7 steps in the back end. It's more complicated, for example, to raise from a finance perspective, to raise that dollar at an event than it might be for a grant or for a corporate sponsorship. Just because I'm having to calculate these fair market values and make sure the receipts are correct and giving the right tax deductible amount and all that.
That makes total sense.
Yeah. A couple other areas is forecasting. When finance is doing a forecast, we typically want to be as conservative as possible, but still realistic. This is common whether it's development or sales in the business world. Some of the estimates tend to be a little rosier, maybe than what you would say is realistic. But that's good. You need that. That's a very healthy thing. You need your development team to be that way. You have to be, because if they're not like that, then you have no shot at getting the money in.
Tom Dauber here for Abundant Vision Philanthropic Consulting. Fundraising can be hard work, and it can be hard to mentally get into the place you need to be in order to see new opportunities. Everyone struggles with it. We are like the fish in the fishbowl who just can't see the water they're swimming in. That's when having outside expertise comes in handy. For 25 years, I've been helping nonprofits analyze their challenges, discover new ways forward, and develop clear plans that lead to greater fundraising revenues. Now I am available to help your organization develop the abundant vision it needs to inspire new levels of philanthropy at your nonprofit as well. Check out abundantvision.net to start your journey toward greater fundraising success today. Now, back to the show. Let's talk about that point a little more if we could.
Yeah.
I've been in charge of fundraising efforts as a chief development officer. And I remember when I first started, my optimism got the best of me a few times, to the point where I had folks, way above me, coming to me saying, "Now, Tom, this doesn't really look right." And I was throwing off their numbers and all those sorts of things. And I guess I had to learn pretty quickly that I've got to be as pessimistic as possible to under promise and over deliver when it comes to that sort of thing. I can think of something that I would do to do that, but I'm curious as a CFO, what sorts of steps can fundraisers take to kind of keep their optimism in control when it comes to making those types of projections?
Well, so one of the tools that I like to use, whether it's a sales pipeline or even development work, is you list the different sources of funding. And it might be we're talking to this large donor. It might be $100,000. We've got these, 5 grants that we've applied for. We've got year-end giving, and we've got a target on it. And then giving each of those a probability that you hit that target. And so maybe there's a 25% chance you get that large donation in, and then you can multiply that 25% times that we think he's going to give $100,000, and you kind of create this projection that way. But what you're doing is you're looking at every individual component of that on a weekly or biweekly, however often basis. I think that's one way to really manage that process.
That's great. That's great advice. Now, I know sometimes that process works in reverse. Sometimes we have the folks at the top coming to us and saying, okay, here's the budget. How are you going to get us to this budget? Really, without the prospect portfolio even in view. How do you deal with that situation?
So from my experience, I always try to push as best as we can heading into a new year, and even as part of the budget process, to spell out as much as we can realistically know is going to come in. Now, does that always happen? Absolutely not. It's usually like, here's our target, development team, work your magic. What I like about establishing that as part of the budget process is all the leaders of the organization are signing off on that. And they're saying, yeah, I'm signing up to help development achieve these goals. And we think this large donor is gonna materialize, and we think this grant is gonna come through. So I feel like that helps in the process when you get a little bit more detailed as a part of that budget season. Things are going to inevitably change probably by the time you even reach February and March,
Yeah.
but I find that to be helpful.
Is there language that chief development officers could use when talking to fiscal officers that might make that conversation easier?
I, I'm a big fan of just sitting down and talking through, hey, here's what I have to do in my role as a chief development officer. Here are
Hmm.
the challenges that I can give you a projection finance, but here's the thing. I'm going to reach out to this grant next week or 2 weeks, and I'm going to find out that they've all of a sudden changed their timeline, or they've closed submissions, or now it's invite only. And so I think just explaining, hey, here are the challenges that I'm going to encounter in trying to reach this goal. And just so the finance team isn't just wondering, why are they not hitting their goal? But explaining, like, hey, this is not as easy as just money comes into the bank and it just magically appears. I'm a big fan of that. And I think it goes the other way too. I think finance explaining, like, hey, I hate to be an administrative burden, and I hate to have to harp on receipts and all but I have to do these things because it's just part of, staying compliant. I think that breaks down so many barriers. I really do.
That's great. That's really helpful. I wish I would have known some of those when I was younger. What other sorts of things come up between CFOs and CDOs?
Yeah, the revenue recognition is one for sure. And so it's just, when does accounting recognize $1 raised versus, if you get the pledge or the commitment for the dollar? I don't know, from a development perspective, you just kind of assume, like, hey, I've got that dollar, it's in the door, and move on to the next dollar, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. So I think there's definitely some more in depth we can cover on that. Another kind of bucket is thinking about restricted donations versus general donations. So
Mm,
I'd
yeah.
be really curious on your perspective on this, but from a finance perspective, I don't think of those at all as the same. Even though, like, it might be, $100,000 restricted donation is, it's not as valuable as a general donation, and it actually creates more work on the finance side of things. We have to keep track of every single restriction, and every time something is spent against that, it's just another entry and another thing that we have to keep track of on the finance side. It's a big difference in what makes nonprofit finance work a little bit more complicated than for profit.
Oh, I bet it does. That was a really big thing that I had to deal with at OSU. And I think every state school, every private school has to deal with that because you have so many restricted endowments. You had so many
Mm-hmm.
restricted, we would call them current use funds, but non endowed funds that might be restricted for a specific purpose. The ironic thing is, a donor's going to give more money to the thing that they care most about. And so that might be scholarships. Well, the moment you start talking scholarships, you're talking restrictions. And so the question is, from a fundraising standpoint, is you can just go after discretionary dollars, but if it results in you raising 25% of what you could raise, is that the best use of your time?
Yeah. And I think just even explaining that on the finance side, I'm like, yeah, that makes perfect sense. You as the fundraiser can better tell the story and hone in on exactly, what they really are focused on. And that's going to result in a bigger donation. And so you would make that trade-off every day.
Really. And the thing that I did find that we could do in a complex place is oftentimes there would be ways of saying, okay, so within the general budget, how much was going, towards scholarships, and can this replace some of that money and even provide more, obviously, than what you were originally going to do, but then free that money up to do something else? If we can fund something with donor dollars, then all of a sudden that, in theory, can free up your discretionary dollars to do the things that nobody's going to pay to fix your bathroom. But at the same time, if your students don't have working toilets, it's going to be a problem for your school. There's things like that, I think, that can be done that still honors the donor intent and honors the restriction, but at the same time allows the college to let its money go further.
Yeah, I think that's a really great approach to it.
So let me flip back over to my questions here. Now, let's say I'm not a development officer. Let's say I'm the CEO of a nonprofit. What should I be thinking about in my work that could make the relationship better and life easier for my CFO and their interactions with the CDO?
I think a lot of times it can feel like you're kind of in your own silo, and I manage finance and I manage development. Finding ways to break those silos, and this is a leadership team, and we are measured on organizational success first. And as a part of creating organizational success, we each have a bucket to operate in. First and foremost, the organization's success should be the number one criteria. And I think just facilitating and kind of driving that home and building the culture around, if the organization doesn't succeed first, even though it might make your department look better or your team look better, then that's a loss. That's not a win. And so I think just developing that culture and just really driving that point home.
That's great. That's great advice, Stephen. That's all the time we have today. But be sure to tune in next week to hear the next part of this exciting conversation. Now, if you've enjoyed this podcast, please be sure to subscribe and give us a 5-star rating on your podcast provider. I'm your host, Tom Dauber. Thank you for joining me as we journey together towards major gift mastery on the Abundant Vision Fundraising Podcast.